Real Estate Pro Talk with your host, Greg Ernie, connecting people, community and property.
Well, hello, Greg Ernie here. Welcome to another episode of Real Estate Pro Talk. Following our discussion that we had last week with Tracy Russell, our property manager, we had a number of calls, and I said last week that we would be covering more changes that are occurring to the Residential Tenancies Act over the next couple of weeks. Well, it's interesting. Since that launched last week, we've had a number of our landlords, we've had a number of other landlords contact us wanting to know more information specifically about some of the changes. And there's some big changes that we're going to go through today, so much so that we're actually going to break this podcast up into four individual little series. And as we take an in-depth look at some major changes. So the changes we're going to cover over the next four shorter podcasts will be modifications to the property and what can happen there. What are the minimum standards to properties, the electrical and gas safety compliance, and also what's involved with selling a property that's tenanted. So today it gives me great pleasure. I know you were at a conference last week, Tracy, learning or a Zoom meeting, I should say, learning more information about these changes and really trying to get your head around it. And It gives me great pleasure to welcome you back.
Thanks for having me back.
So, Tracy, we're going to break this into four series because I know there's a lot to go through. Probably first of all, what I would like to talk about is modifications to property. There's a lot of worry out there, especially, and we're probably when we cover this podcast, we're looking really to probably answer the questions from the landlords because they seem to be the most concerned. So if any tenant is watching this, it's not that we're favouring landlords or whatever, but certainly the majority of changes, the ones that are most concerned are the landlords. So we're going to be looking at these in depth from a landlord's perspective. And the first point is what modifications or can a rental provider, so to speak, impose conditions and approval for modification? How does that work?
Okay, so today, Greg, I've actually brought some notes. So I may refer to them from time to time.
Tracy, you refer to them as much as you like because
there's a lot going on, and some of the topics that we're going to be talking today aren't a simple answer. So with modifications, it's broken down to what a tenant can do without consent and what a tenant has to get permission for. So basically when it comes to tenants being able to make modifications to your property are going to be things like picture hooks in walls, safety anchor devices, TV wall mounts, installation of LED light globes, installation of security lights, alarm systems, and replacement of curtains. So if you've got really old curtains in your property, a tenant then can actually put their own curtains up, but they do need to keep the original.
Right.
So with going back to the TV wall mounts and picture hooks, that is only if it's plaster walls. So if you've got a concrete wall or a brick wall, then a tenant has to ask permission.
Yep.
The good thing is tenants will still need to reinstate the property to its current condition prior to vacating the property.
So and I think that's probably one of the biggest questions. And I know a lot of landlords will be thinking, oh, gee, I've just painted the home throughout. I've now got new tenants that are moving in. Tenant moves in and they want to put a lot of family pictures and all of that. And I think this is why the changes have come in so that tenants can make the homes their family home.
Sure.
Which is good. So, but what you're saying though, a landlord can at least be rest assured that when the tenant goes, they've got to, correct me if I'm wrong, but pull out the picture hooks, paint the wall, patch the little holes. Is that right?
Yeah, reinstate it to its original condition, except for fair wear and tear.
Yep.
But there's also room to negotiate with your owner. So if you've got a tenant who's done a portrait wall and they've got 20 hooks with 20 pictures, as you see in some homes, as an owner, you wouldn't want those 20 hooks left in the wall. So I think it's reasonable to say to the tenant, they do need to be removed at the end of the tenancy, and you will need to patch the holes and paint it the same colour.
Yes.
So that can be assured that's what I would be wanting if I was an owner.
Yes.
If it's just one or two picture hooks, personally, I'd be saying to an owner, leave them there, because the next tenancy that comes in, they're probably going to want to use them, and it'll save them having to put more picture hooks in a wall. You want a tenant to be comfortable in a home.
And there's with all of this, Tracy, there's a fair element of common sense. So likewise as well. And once again, if I assume something and it's not right, you let me know.
I will.
But if a tenant moves into a home and the let's say the lounge room walls haven't been painted for 15 years and there's quite a few marks and whatever, then the tenant, if the tenant goes and then puts 10 picture hooks up on a property, a landlord's probably going to struggle to then get the tenant to patch and paint the wall, because it will also be looked at, well, when the tenant moved in there, it wasn't in brand new. Exactly.
So the condition of the property when the tenant moved in, and VCAT do depreciate over time. So I think it's 7 years that they say, well, every 7 years a property should be repainted.
Yep.
Now you should be able to get 15 years out of a good paint job.
Yeah.
But that's what VCAT do. They depreciate it. So if you've got 1 or 2 picture hooks and it is a 15-year-old wall with lots of wear and tear, and there was probably a few nail holes in that wall anyway, you're probably not going to get anything.
Yep.
So it is important to understand that there are things in the Act to protect the owner in regards to modifications being done. Child safety gates, they can put those in. I've seen damage with child safety gates because where they actually anchor up against the walls, when they remove them, it generally leaves
ring
marks or damages the paint. So something like that, again, depending on the age of the property, we would have every right to be able to say to the tenant, well, you need to patch that up and patch it in a similar colour. It is very hard to patch paint too.
So tenants move into a home and they want to paint the walls in yellow paint. Can that be done?
Not without the owner's consent, but an owner can't reasonably refuse either.
Yep.
So things like painting walls, installation of security doors, fly screens, if they want to do a vegetable garden or a herb garden, a tenant does need to get approval from the owner to do that. With those major modifications, so with painting, you can actually ask a tenant for an additional bond for that, because depending on what they want to do, you want to make sure at the end of the tenancy, again, they go in to reinstate the property to its original condition.
Yep.
If for any reason they go paint the walls purple and they leave at the end of the tenancy, by taking an additional bond, by getting a quote from a tradesperson to find out what it would cost to reinstate the property to its original condition, hopefully that's going to give an owner a bit of peace of mind that if the tenant doesn't do it, they're going to have that additional bond to do the works.
Okay, that's interesting, because you've never really been able to do that. So,
no.
And you when we had on our last podcast, we were talking about, can owners ask for a higher bond for pets? So unless it was $900 per week, you can't do that.
Exactly.
But in this instance, from what you're saying, doesn't matter the rental amount.
Exactly.
So if there's works that a tenant wants to do, the tenant's got to get permission, and as part of the permission, the landlord is in their right to potentially ask for a higher bond to cover the
works.
Okay.
So what we would be recommending to an owner, and this is going to come back to how you handle a request, especially for painting. We will be wanting to know what colour, what rooms. There's different types of paint. You can do the suede paint. Now that suede paint takes a lot to bring it back because it's a lot more sanding.
Yeah.
So, we might even ask the type of paint they're going to use. Then we might get a tradesperson, a qualified painter, to give us a quote on what it would cost to bring that property back to what it currently is prior to the tenant doing what they need to do, what they are requesting to do.
Yep.
So if the quote comes in at $800, then you have every right to go to the tenant and go, Mr. Tenant, the owner is happy for you to do this, but we will want an additional $800 bond, just in case for any reason you can't do the works at the end of the tenancy and the owner needs to bring it back to what it originally was.
So in the guidelines, is there anything coming out for landlords and for tenants as to what's changes that a tenant can do without sort of seeking permission, and what's more major? Is that sort of been described a little bit?
Well, there is, and just on some of the things that I've gone through today are things that they've highlighted.
Yep.
So I think the minor things like your picture hooks, your installation of LED light globes, they're easily fixed. But something like painting a home, even down to put in a security door on, again, if they want to take that security door at the end of the tenancy, an owner's going to be left with holes from the installation of the security door.
Yep.
So again, we'd be getting something from the tenant to say, okay, will you leave that at the end of the tenancy? So an owner might be happy if a tenant wants to put a security door on, but knowing they're going to leave that security door at the end of the tenancy, or are they going to remove it and then reinstate that frame to its original condition? So anything that's going to, I suppose, change your property significantly, that is going to cause damage from a removal of an item are the things that a tenant does need to get permission for.
Oh, Tracy, as I listen to what, and we've just scratched the surface on that, but I just think of the amount of administration that's involved is incredible. But anyway, I hope that gives landlords a good understanding of modifications to property. Obviously, tenants as well. No doubt it'll be something that we'll work through as well. So.
Well, it's the communication, Greg, and I think once you've communicated with your tenant and the landlord, it's then putting a special condition in place to be signed by the tenant, and we'll sign them on behalf of the agent to make sure everyone knows exactly what is expected at the end of a tenancy.
Brilliant. Tracy, really good information. That's our part one of these changes for modifications to a property. We're now going to move to part two, which is minimum standards to rental properties. So that concludes this podcast. And for those that want to know about what the minimum standard to rental properties are, tune in for our next podcast and we'll be able to go through that. Great. Tracy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.